Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to a topic which obviously is very timely and is clearly dominating the news, and that is Venezuela. And what we're going to try to do here tonight is analyze the current political and economic situation in Venezuela, but also try to look a little bit to the future. What does this mean? Where are the protests heading? Where is the government heading in terms of its own economic policies? And what could be, it should be, and is the international reaction. Is that sufficient right now? I'm pleased to say we have a great panel here. Javier is a professor at Amherst College, has written extensively about Venezuela and Cuba and Argentina and a lot of other things, LGBT rights. He's also, I think what he's most proud of is he's on the editorial board of America's Quarterly. He's most recently had a book with Carlos Romero about Venezuela, which actually I have assigned to my class, so you'll get a good test. Alejandro Grisanti is head of research and strategy at Latin America at Barclays Capital. He also is an expert on Venezuela, being Venezuelan, but that doesn't necessarily make you an expert. But he also covers it in his day-to-day job and also looks at the issues of petroleum and oil production. And Luisa Palacios is head of Latin America and macro and energy research at Medley Global Advisors. Before this, she was also at Barclays Capital and is an expert on financial and economic and also energy issues in Venezuela. So thanks all of you. Thanks to the audience. We also have people participating via webcast. So I just want to say in advance, if you have questions in the question and answer period, feel free to tweet them to us, and I will try my best to get the panelists to answer them. The plan is I'm going to conduct this discussion Davos style. Try to make this an informal discussion in which all of the participants can comment sort of extemporaneously on some of the questions I raise, but also comment on each other's reactions and discussions and try to get this into a free-flowing discussion. And then I'll invite all of you to join it, and also hopefully the people who are here via our webcast. So let me start actually with the politics. And of course here, the issue in Venezuela is so much as the politics and the economics are tightly bound up. But I'm going to make a somewhat false distinction here and sort of ask, Javier, give us a sense of what's happening with the protests. What do they represent in terms of the opposition? What are their demands at this point, now that they've gone on for so long? And how's the government's reaction? Give us a sense also what's happening in the government in terms of their own reaction. We've certainly seen Maduro having very little tolerance, except maybe some token efforts at social peace and conferences to address it. But give us a sense of what's going on the street.
Sure. The protests have a certain degree of ambiguity about them. There's an element about the protest that resonates with the majority of the population. They're complaining about all the governance problems that anybody, an ordinary person in Venezuela, will confront, ranging from insecurity to cost of living to lack of transparency in the government. And these are themes that most public opinion polls tell us resonate with most Venezuelans, independent on whether one is of any ideological orientation or not. So at the level of complaints about governance, and there are many complaints, there is real clarity there. But the question is, what do they want to do in terms of political change? What would be the conditions for a negotiation? Do they want to negotiate? And if so, what would they negotiate about? Or is this a completely anti-status quo movement? And if so, can it be contained somehow? At the moment, I think that they have. This is not the first time that students have led the resistance. They have led the previous resistance, and very effectively. They are the one force in Venezuela that remains autonomous and able to really make the government reflect and sit back. The rest of the opposition normally the government kind of ignores, but students really have the capacity in Venezuela to get the government, this is the Maduro government as well as the Chavez administration, to sort of like re-strategize. And in that sense, it's good that it's happening, given that for the first time we can say there is a little bit of checks and balance in Venezuela. And insofar as that has happened, I think it has been a positive step.
Checks and balance in terms of the street balancing the government?
Instead of the street, yes. In terms of, we are not going to tolerate a few more things. But then again, who knows how the government is going to respond to some of these checks and balances.
Well, give me a sense. Two things. One is there are a host of economic concerns, which we'll talk about. Inflation approaching 60%, stagnant economic growth, an overvalued currency scarcity. To what extent are these protests being driven by economic demands, or to what extent are they being driven by political demands, or that they could risk being hijacked by an opposition that, let's be honest, basically in 2001, 2002, made a career out of taking the streets and trying to protest. Give me a sense of what's different about these, if there's anything different about these protests from the ones, say, 12, 13 years ago, and the risk of them becoming the conflict or of economic and political in this.
Yeah, no, let's work with this comparison. I think there are parallels as well as important differences from the protests of 2001 to 2004. Let's do some of the parallels. It is happening at the beginning of an administration that is revealing a side that Venezuelans find incredibly appalling. In 2001, it was the issue of decrees and Chavez's desire to govern unilaterally. This time, one could say it's the fact that Maduro has basically continued with the same policies that have failed, as well as persevered in the militarization of the government and no responses to economic policy. So in that sense, it's a honeymoon going awry. It's also street level, but I do not think that the opposition, the students who are out in the streets, are interested in overthrowing the government. There was a sense in 2001 that with a lot of street presence, they can precipitate a change of some sort, a resignation or an internal dispute, or even the referendum. I think this time around, the opposition knows that that's not what they want to do, that that's not exactly how far they want to go, and they have a sense of moderation in that regard. They want to get to a point where they can actually, in my opinion, weaken the government enough to have the government sit down with them and offer them bigger concessions. So get to a point of weakness, not necessarily of the government, not necessarily a point of the government should go. I am sure there are many folks in the opposition who would like regime change, but the lessons from 2001 to 2004 are clear to most smart people in the opposition in Venezuela today.
Well, certainly in 2000, 2001, there was a whole flurry of street-type coups, which are not. Look at Argentina, where not only they had presidential inflation.
Yes, there were about 8 or 7 interrupted presidencies.
Ecuador,
right.
you've Bucaram, Jamil Mahuad, Lucio Gutierrez. It wasn't uncommon. I think it wasn't uncommon.
Yeah, the last one was in Argentina in 2001 when De la Rua leaves office and you get the 5 presidencies. So that happened at that time, and we haven't had that chain of events so clearly this time around, although we have had the Celaya and Lugo incident. But they're very different, and people are very cautious with that. I think the opposition knows that an extra constitutional end of the regime is not a step forward. Yeah,
well, it certainly wouldn't solve the economic problem. So Luisa, go ahead.
I just wanted to elaborate on what Javier is saying. The first thing that I would like to say is that, to me, this is a movement that seems more like a bottoms-up approach rather than a top-down, which I think differentiates with the 2000 events, because this is a movement that started in Mérida, in Táchira. It did not involve Caracas, which is different. Caracas is normally the first one to lead. No, this is Táchira and Mérida. And I think that's a very important distinction, because Táchira and Mérida are two states that exemplify the worst of the scarcity, inflation, unemployment, the economic side of, or the economic underpinning or rationale for the desperation that I think is taking place. The other thing is that I think when we talk about the opposition, this is really a social movement. The opposition was, discussing, it was in a completely different dynamics. This was just erupted. This erupted and it escalated. It was a student movement, but it was not only about students, it was about young people. And a lot has to do with, I think, I've always listened to pollsters in Venezuela that say that the understanding about your future is one of the most important predictors of how popularity falls. And I think there's a differentiation about popularity levels at age level. So what I see from these students is desperation about their future, is that they see no future. And so the cost of protesting for them is actually low. And so it is a very different social movement. And it seems to me that the political elite, then the opposition, is trying to interpret, trying to give it meaning, trying to control it. There is some opposition groups, political leaders that are trying to move the movement into one direction. Others believe that it should have a completely different meaning. But the thing is that it is it's a social movement, and the conditions that led to that social movement, to me, means that this is not going away. This might reduce in intensity, maybe, but there's a lot going on that already led to this social explosion.
Alejandro, do you want to comment on that? No, we'll ask you economic questions too, but we're on
yes,
the political
of course.
frame.
No, I basically agree with Luisa that this is getting out of the hands of all the political leaders, okay? Because we also have the militia from the government, okay? The paramilitary groups that is also starting, the colectivos that are also starting to be out of the control of the government, okay? We already have like 3 or 4 between National Guard and people from the army forces that was killed apparently from the colectivos. We have a situation, as Luisa says, that came from the bottom, okay, that I believe that the principal leaders who start the whole process, they were really impressed of the reaction that they have. I am talking about Leopoldo López, María Corina Machado, and Antonio Ledesma, that start to say, okay, let's start to try to hit the streets. And when they realize, we have a fire on the street the following day, and they didn't expect that. And I will say that they were not prepared, okay, to control that.
Does that mean the opposition is divided? We hear,
look,
it's telling people to pull back?
2 issues. I completely agree, but I also worry about what we were saying. You have to worry a little bit about a social movement that is too autonomous, that it doesn't have a rudder. And so far it's been good, but at some point this could be trouble. But for now, contrary to what people have been saying, the opposition is being united again. Yes, there was a big division. There has always existed this division in all oppositions against this type of regime. You get the proverbial division between softliners and hardliners, and Venezuela is no different. Outside of an electoral arena, once the elections of December ended, there were fewer incentives to remain united, and so the divisions among the professional politicians resurfaced with a vengeance. But what is remarkable is that the protests, together with the government's response, has reunited the opposition. Now, Capriles is the most important defender of the students, of Leopoldo López. It is an interesting situation of regelling. And that is actually good news for now, which also could worry some of us, because it might give some members of the opposition the belief that maintaining this level of street protests is good for them in terms of uniting them. But so far, I think for now they're displaying a degree of unity that probably surpasses the degree of unity of the government, of the administration.
We'll get back to that.
Yes.
Because we're going to talk about economics, and that also, obviously, the unity of the government affects how it's going to tackle any of these very looming, large and looming economic problems. So give us a sense, Luisa, about what what's happening in the economy, what's driving it as well.
I mean, we both, Alejandro and I, will give our own versions of this. To me, what I see is Venezuela going through a very significant external adjustment that took place mostly in 2013. This adjustment was an adjustment of private sector imports. Pretty much the government decided to starve the private sector of dollars in order to import basic raw materials or different components. As it did that, every single sector had all kinds of issues in their own productive chain. And what we're seeing is that that has led the economy into a kind of a standstill to a degree that the only thing that I can compare it to is either what happened in the first months of 2013 or the oil strike of 2003. I mean, it is a complete standstill. It's like the private sector did not go on strike. They were defaulted on by the government by not giving them dollars. And so you see all kinds of bottlenecks everywhere. People that have inventories, or companies, all sectors that have inventories for 1 month, for 3 weeks. For example, the automobile sector that keeps very good statistics. The amount of automobile units produced in Venezuela declined by more than 80% in January, and year on year. The same thing in February. All the units produced in January were produced by Toyota, that said that was leaving the country. So much.
Does that mean that Iranian automobile factory isn't producing anything yet?
Well, they might be importing, but the big companies, Chrysler, General Motors, Ford, Toyota, are basically not producing. And I'm just giving you one number from the automobile industry, but it's the same thing in the pharmaceutical industry, in the food industry. It's all over the place. What you see is capacity utilization at, I don't know, below 50% in a lot of these industries. And so all of that led to a significant increase in inflation and a significant increase in scarcity. And so the government, I think, compounded the issue by the actions it did on November while it was trying to win the elections, because it also created even more uncertainty about the rules of the game for the private sector. So the private sector is at a standstill. And so the economy is suffering deeply from all the measures that were taken, in addition to the significant decline in foreign exchange. And so the government, what we see now is that I think it finally realized something that he had never realized before, which is that actually the private sector is important for its own survival. I think they're too late for this, but that had never happened in Venezuela before, because the Venezuelan political elite, to me, or the Chavista, they see the private sector as the enemy. And it's the first time where they start to see, oh, we went too far. And so to me, the external adjustment that happened in Venezuela in 2013 went too far, and now they have to actually go back. But they did this external adjustment without really devaluing, and so it did not reap the benefits of an improvement in the fiscal accounts. So you had an external adjustment done through volumes, but not the subsequent adjustment in the exchange rate, which significantly helps the fiscal account. So you have the worst of both worlds. And so now the government has to decide first to reverse the external adjustment because it went too far, and now it has to devalue by a lot in order to deal with the dollar liquidity situation. The thing to me is that does nothing in relation to the external liquidity situation, because what we have seen is that there's so much adjustment that you can do only by clamping out or reducing demand for dollars. It backfire on you. And now, so the only way for Venezuela to grow out of this is to produce more dollars. But they have very limited capacity to produce more dollars, because pretty much it is a function of oil production and oil prices, both of which, to me, are in very serious challenges.
Okay, that's great. Let's take a few of those issues, and Alejandro, give me a sense of when and what is going to happen. Let's take the devaluation. It seems they just introduced another exchange rate. Okay, so give me a sense of, on the exchange rate front, what's going on and what can we expect?
Yeah, I mean, at least in Barclays, we are expecting that the new exchange rate system, that is the CCAT2, will start anytime soon. It will start as soon as in 2 or 3 days, in Thursday or next Monday. I mean, there were different meetings between the central bank and the financial system that basically was looking toward that. And this, as Luisa say, this new system will start at level of 50 to 60 bolivars per dollar and will represent a huge devaluation for the country. Our calculation indicate that the average exchange rate, the exchange rate from SICAD, in Sidme, Caribe, and the black market or the non-official rate last year was 9.9 bolivars per dollar, and we will have a movement, okay, in our calculation of this 9.9 bolivars per dollar to 23.24 bolivars per dollar. I mean, we are talking a devaluation of almost 60%, okay, in the value of the bolivar that the private sector will suffer. In addition of that, I want to complement a little bit of what Luisa say, is that basically this was not planned by the government. It was not that the government decided to have an external adjustment on what will be the most efficient way to try to adjust externally. Was basically that they create a system, an exchange rate control that have a huge gap between two official rates, okay, and another gap with a non-official rate that basically was impossible that the flows of dollars goes and will be received by the private sector. So the private sector, the government, all the flow that was produced by Venezuela was basically used or misused in corruption, overpricing, a public import that are much more inefficient than the other one, and the one that was suffering, the one that until now received all the costs was the private sector.
But does a devaluation, which seems evident, will that address everything from the fiscal imbalances?
I believe that all exchange rate controls are bad, okay, but as the exchange rate controls that are stronger, more rigid, okay, than others will be worse. In this case, the thing that we are looking is that the government is moving, okay, to a more flexible system where the private sector will be able to buy dollars, but there is still a very big contradiction on the system. 1 month ago, they approved the law of the right price, okay, where the priority good need to be that your ganancias, your
earnings.
Your earnings cannot be higher than 30%. That you don't know, for example, with the new system, you will not solve any of the problems that the priority good still have. I mean, Polar, for example, cannot buy corn at the non-official rate to make the corn flavor, or any of the priority sector will be able to access this dollar given the fact that they have a very strict price control. This flexibilization will help the non-priority goods. I think there will be a lot of people in the retail sector that will import cellular phone, iPod, etc. But this is not something that will solve the principal problem that Venezuela have on that front.
And the effects on inflation, which are already at close to 60%?
Yeah, at the end, the principal question is what will happen with the rest of the economic policy. Last year, Venezuela, or the Central Bank of Venezuela, monetized almost 12% of the GDP, okay, and give this amount of money to the public enterprise and PDVSA. The big question is, do they will continue doing that, or they will stop, okay, or reduce at least the part of monetization? Until now, I didn't receive any clear signal from the government that they will have like a fiscal responsibility, that they are looking to decrease the level of monetization over the economy. And if this is the case, this will be a new system that will fail. Because at the end, if you create more money and put more money on the economy, and this money will look for goods, service, and the dollars, we will have a very strong devaluation again of this CCAT2 rate, and the government will be forced to close this market again.
Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that the government is unable to contain the demand for dollars. There is a skyrocketing demand of dollars. And unless you deal with some of the macroeconomic distortions and the, as Luisa was saying, the policies that scare away the private sector, you almost have an irrepressible demand for dollar. And so they will devalue, but then the demand will continue to be high. And so I agree that this is no solution unless something is done with this very high demand of dollars.
Well, let's get into the politics of it too. I mean, you know, if you listen to the speeches of Maduro, one would think it's not in their DNA to do anything that's favorable to the private sector. So, except maybe political survival. So what is going to drive this? If I mean, maybe it's just sheer calculations of political survival, but give me a sense of what this means in terms of their own vision of their Bolivarian economics and their own divisions within the government and the PSUV.
Well, right. It's not within their DNA.
I know you're a political scientist and not a geneticist.
It is.
So,
it is. I think the government, the Chavista administration since 2003 has always felt that at the end of the day, oil is going to generate enough and that's going to save them. And this is the first time that we're seeing perhaps one scenario in which oil dollars are not going to be able to save the government. So we will see whether the government will react as to most governments facing all these external problems and macroeconomic problems and begin to perhaps generate some more market-oriented responses. They have been very hesitant. There's only one announcement of a change in the exchange rate. Nothing else is being done. So it could very well be that this regime is going to kill itself because of its DNA, because it seems like it's unable to read the signals that are out there. And what is so interesting is that if you compare Venezuela to other ALBA countries, many of those ALBA countries are picking up market signals much, much better than Venezuela is. So it has to do with their DNA, the extent to which they continue to be so anti-business class and so such strong believers in controlling market forces rather than working with market forces.
Yeah, Evo Morales was downright Thatcherite compared to Maduro. I mean, the way, you know, the measured response in terms of spending. But go ahead.
No, that actually elaborating on what you guys are saying is that, to me, because of their DNA, the burden of proof is on them. You cannot give them the benefit of the doubt that they will do the right thing. And we all think like that. The private sector in Venezuela thinks like that. And that is a major obstacle in order for this very timid movement towards a more flexibilization of the exchange rate to work. Because you know that at the end, they're not doing this out of conviction. And then there's other issues as well that you don't know if this is going to be, as Alejandro was saying, you don't know if this is going to survive. Because you don't see any of the other elements for this to survive to be put in place. And so it seems to me that it could lead also to a lot of capital flight because you don't know how long you're going to have this this opening of dollars. So these kinds of changes on the FX policy have to be accompanied by, you know, other changes on the overall macroeconomic environment. And I think the political situation does not help because they do clearly believe that the economics can go on one hand and the politics can go on the other hand, and the opposition and the private sector are one of the same. You cannot really be talking to the private sector and then, you know, using repression and censorship to the opposition as if there were two different actors. They're just one of the same. A lot of the private sector is in the opposition. That is completely correct. There is a reason why that is the case. And the other thing that I would say is that I think this is a very problematic, the next months ahead are very problematic for Maduro. So even if the protests reduce in intensity, I think they're not going to go away because what we have ahead is actually more inflation, more scarcity, probably increasing unemployment. Because even if you start to give the dollars to the private sector tomorrow, you're not going to see imports in 2 to 3 months. And so the situation that you're going to see in 2 to 3 months are a result of the lack of dollar and all the policies that you enacted in the past months. And I think Maduro really does not have the capacity to delay gratification. So I think he's going to be in a difficult position.
Alejandro, Luisa is here listed as the person who works on energy, but I want to ask you the question, because you wrote a great article, which is still one of the most popular articles on our website for America's Quarterly, on oil and oil production. Luisa mentioned that oil production is going to remain flat at best, and prices will probably not vary much. So they're looking at not a lot of new dollars coming in from that. Give us a sense of what's going on in the oil sector.
Okay, one of the problems that we have when we compare many of the analysts that are talking about oil production and possible oil export is more important than the oil production, because at the end, the difference between oil production and oil export is the internal market that is basically free and do not improve any capacity to pay, is that basically we use different sources that include different products. So this is very important because, for example, right now at Barclays, we are using a database that is that came from Petrologistic. Okay, Petrologistic basically is a British company that uses the ADL of all the tankers that are going out Venezuela. So basically, we receive information of the name of the tanker, how many barrels are in this tanker, where he's going, okay, and we can make calculation about this.
Let me just ask a question on that. Is that how do you differentiate between those that are going to the market and those that are going to Petrocaribe or to Nicaragua or Cuba?
Would you repeat that, sorry?
How can you tell if those tankers, say, are going to be sold on the market or are just going for giveaways to Cuba?
Yeah, you can follow the ADL, the one that are going directly to Cuba,
okay,
to the refinery of Cienfuegos,
okay,
but you cannot fully analyze the full effect over the Petrocaribe because most of the rest of the island receive oil. Instead of oil, they receive gasoline from the refinery on Curaçao.
Okay.
So say Venezuela is sending oil to Curaçao, and Curaçao is resending that gasoline to the rest of the subsidized sales that Venezuela is doing to the Petrocaribe. But you can follow that thing.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt.
So
I was just
no, it's perfect. In that from Venezuela, according to Petrologistic, Venezuela have net oil export of 2.1 million barrels per day. Okay, of this amount, around 200,000 barrels a day are going to the payment of China, and 200,000 are going to the level of subsidy that Petrocaribe have. No? There is also a confusion on the market. No? Many people believe the Petrocaribe agreement are near 400,000 barrels per day. Of this amount, approximately half of them are charged in cash by PDVSA, and the other half is a very a debt with a very high level of subsidy. Okay, in the agreement, basically say that in that level of debt, okay, the debt that PDVSA is handling to República Dominicana, to Dominican Republic, to Nicaragua, etc., they can pay in species. Okay, it's not the other amount, the cash amount they need to pay, and the other amount, the one that is that have the debt, is the one that they pay in species. I say that because at the end, when we will analyze the cash flow, at the end we have 2.1 million in export, less 200,000 in amortization to China, and 200,000 that Venezuela is not collecting from Petrocaribe, and this gives you a net oil export, the export that produce cash of around 1.7 million barrels per day.
And you're saying that isn't enough?
At 6.3, the exchange rate will not be enough. At 6.3, and this is one of the principal problems that Luisa was talking. At 6.3, the government will never have enough dollars, okay, to supply the demand. Because there is two reasons for that. The first one is that we are having a very strong overvaluation of the currency, an overvaluation that could be higher than 60%, an equilibrium exchange rate could be something near 18 to 20 bolivars per dollar. But in addition for that, you have a rate that is almost 1/15 of the non-official rate. So this is one at 6.3 and the other one that reached 90. That is telling the Venezuelan that the best thing that they can buy is a dollar at 6.3 on the official market. So that's the reason that the demand will always be unlimited. And if you do not fix, in my opinion, the principal and longest distortion in Venezuela, that is the capital control, you will continue with this economic crisis from time to time.
Okay, but I'll ask a last round of questions, and I want to open it up for questions from the audience and also from any people on the webcast. So, well, actually, two to Javier first. One, why don't you just stop exporting to Petrocaribe? Why not? There's an easy way there. You stop shipping those giving away those 200,000 barrels of oil a day, and you're doing a little better there. What's the political calculation there?
By the way, we start to hear from the government that.
Yeah, oh, really?
If the problem increases, we can stop that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you have seen other governments in Central America. I think Guatemala has said that it's no longer as good a deal as it used to be. And so we're going to see some adjustment, but it's nonetheless a very important question as to the political value of Petrocaribe. You know, they are all independent nations. They produce one vote at international organizations. That is an amazing achievement on Venezuela's diplomacy. But it is also, I've written about this, the regime is unable to score its brand name. Let me put it this way. It has a brand name of helping the poor, of helping folks for development, that you can forgive this government for all kinds of illiberal practices, but deep down, they care about the have-nots. Yes, they are a petrostate, an oil power, but they have the ability to distribute domestically and internationally. And Petrocaribe is an important part of that. It's Venezuela's soft power. For those of you who follow the work of Joe Nye, who says that nations try to generate something that is appealing about their foreign policy, something that people like and welcome. And so this is an aspect that Chavez created. It wasn't entirely popular with folks in Venezuela, but he understood that it helped Venezuela build its brand name as a nation that despite the contradiction of being a country that owns this massive oil company that generates so much dollars from the US economy, from the empire, that it nonetheless uses it to distribute to smaller. So it is very, very important to the government as a foreign policy strategy.
On the international dimension, UNASUR is, after the inauguration of President Bachelet in Chile, talked about intervening in some form of mediation in Venezuela. Will that, is that possible? Will it bear fruit? I mean, is the opposition willing to sit down? Is again, getting to the DNA question, again, we're not geneticists. Next time we'll put one on the panel. But is the government ready to do that?
Let me begin by saying, something I've said before, is that the promotion of democracy in the Americas, but especially in UNASUR, has morphed into a regime for the defense of incumbents. This is what this has become.
Good.
So let's start with that, and that's why, number one. And number two, it's important to remember that two major players in UNASUR, Brazil and Chile, have had, both countries, very serious student protests. And the last thing they're going to do is to take the side of the protest, because Rousseff would not have liked it when she was facing really, really serious protests in the summer. Even Bachelet, before the protests that Piñera had in 2011, 2012, we don't remember them, but they were very serious. These protests actually began under Bachelet in 2006. They were called the Penguin protests. I'm sure Bachelet knows that the education problems in her own country are unresolved, and she anticipates to have protests of her own. So, you know, this is not going to be an impartial mediating body that is going to...
The nature of the protest is entirely different.
Absolutely.
Let's put this in context. In both Brazil and Chile, in fact, there's almost sort of a salutary reason for the protests. This is the middle class is demanding better education. In Venezuela, it's linked to the complete economic deterioration, the lack of sort of... There's not the capacity to sort of differentiate?
Absolutely. They're very different. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the Chilean protests and the Brazilian protests are very middle class, because a lot of people have used that description to disparage the Venezuelan protests, saying that the Venezuelan protests are middle class. But you're right, the ones in Chile, which the left embraced, and the ones in Brazil, which the left also embraced, were also middle class, and naturally so. But they are protests against an incumbent. And UNASUR and a lot of what is happening in the promotion of democracy has become, we're going to defend the incumbent of all possible challenges. And so it's an unfortunate situation, in my opinion, what has happened in international relations, that we now, that governments think mostly of promotion of democracy as making sure that the incumbents are not facing serious challenges from societal actors.
Luisa, I want to go back to the petroleum issue, because I know you are an energy expert, so give us your take also on what has to be done. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser for the question I'm going to ask Alejandro. What about the risk of default? I mean, given that there may not be, dollars aren't coming in enough, even with the refined exchange rate, should banks be worried?
Let me start with Alejandro's comments on oil. I think the work that he just mentioned about actually tracking down what the level of exports in Venezuela really is extremely important for markets, because we are all number guessing exactly what level of exports are realizing oil prices. I want to actually complement that answer from two different perspectives. The first one is that Exactly because Venezuela does not realize oil prices. You know, a lot of its oil production, particularly its oil exports. One thing that we have done is look at the U.S. market and the Indian market, which are 66% of Venezuela's exports, and we know for sure these two exports are the most important in terms of oil. In the last quarter of 2013, Venezuela's exports to the U.S. declined by about 25%, and Venezuela's exports to India declined by 15%. And so, we are seeing the same trend in January and February. So, regardless of what is happening with Venezuelan, total exports, the two markets where it's most important that you actually maintain your market share, you're actually falling more rapidly than the total market share, than the total level of exports. The thing is that what I wanted to compliment Alejandro is that you don't only have a problem of volume, you actually have a problem of price. Because one of the things that we're seeing is that, I don't know if in the US you have seen a significant decline in US, in the level of imports, oil imports from the US. But that decline is only in light heavy oil, not in heavy oil. In heavy oil, it's actually remained stagnant, which is great for Latin American producers, if it's not for the fact that the Canadians are completely displacing the Latin Americans. Canada's exports to the US increased by 600,000 barrels per day since 2010, and we see the same decline in Latin American oil exports to the US. And so what we're seeing is that the Canadians are pricing their oil at about $20 discount to WTI. That was in 2013, the average decline of West Canada oil was $20 less than WTI. Venezuela was pricing its oil at $5 premium to WTI. And Maya, Mexican Maya, which is the other most important exporter apart from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, was also pricing at a slight premium. What has happened is that Maya is already, in the first month of 2014, Maya went from pricing a slight premium on average in 2013 to already a discount of $10 per WTI. Venezuela is starting to discount WTI. So what does that mean? That doesn't really matter what happens to WTI. Venezuela's oil price has only one way to go, which is down, because if not, they're going to lose market share. Nustar, a very small company that nobody has heard of probably, decided at the end of 2013 to cancel its long-term oil supply contract with Venezuela for 30,000 barrels per day. And they replaced it with Canadian oil. And so, a lot of Venezuela's supply contracts are longer term. Venezuela doesn't start to price its oil much more competitively. What is going to happen is that they're going to lose market share both in the US. What happened in India is exactly the same thing, because all of the oil producers in Latin America, all of which are heavy oil, are now desperately going to India to sell their oil. And they have Pacific ports. The Colombians now have significantly increased their market share in India, even the Brazilians, the Mexicans, and so Venezuela's lost. Venezuela used to have, in the first semester of 2013, 66% of Latin America's oil exports to India is now 40%. The last January and February numbers. So it tells me that there's a market war for heavy oil taking place in India and the US, and Venezuela is losing that war. So it's not only a matter of volumes. It is the risk is in terms of price, regardless of what the WTI is doing.
Interesting. Just one quick point on that. Can Venezuela eventually regain it? Let's imagine. I mean, is this a long-term problem for Venezuela, irrespective of the? It
is a long-term challenge for Latin American oil producers, because the Canadians are in the pipeline. There's about 200 to 400,000 barrels per day of Canadian oil. That the problem is that it needs to get the infrastructure to ship it to the U.S. But that is the challenge is for all of them, and Venezuela seems oblivious to the fact that this is taking place. I see the Mexicans much more reactive, understanding that they need to market their oil. So at this point, if you have oil, and the Saudis actually are starting to discount as well. So if you are Valero, for example, that is a refinery that buys oil from Venezuela, oil from Saudi, and oil from the Mexicans, and so you see Venezuela as probably an unreliable supplier, and actually selling you the oil very, very more expensively, and all the others want to undercut their contracts, you are going to start to lose market share. So it is a matter of not only reliability, but in terms of marketing, of actually being much more aggressive with your pricing.
Alejandro, what should I do with my Venezuelan bonds? Should I be worried?
I mean, of course, you can never sleep when you have Venezuelan debt, no? But then something similar or a different approach that I have with the Venezuelan debt is Venezuela is exporting around and receiving cash for around $70 billion, okay, $70 billion. And the external debt payment is around $14 billion from now until 2007. The ratio of income to the total external debt service is similar to 20%. So this is more or less the same of a household that have debt for 20% of their income. Something that is a ratio that, in my opinion, is still attractive. Apart from that, Venezuela 3 or 4 weeks ago, and principally PDVSA, was yielding 22%. I mean, 20% higher than the Treasury bills. And that's the reason that Barclays moved to overweight. Okay, Barclays moved to overweight because a huge devaluation of the Bolivar will improve the capacity to pay of the government, and the external debt service ratio over total oil export is still feasible. Okay? Venezuela clearly is a non-sustainable history. Okay, they need to make changes. I mean, I cannot discuss that if they maintain this type of policy forever, they will not survive. They will need to make a default. But they still have a lot of degrees of freedom. They could reduce the shipment to Petrocaribe or eliminate them. They could try to reduce or to devalue the currency even stronger in order to diminish the incentive that the exchange rate control is having over this. I mean, there is a clear unsustainable history, but there are still some degrees of freedom that the government has that they can change in order to improve that things. No. The other thing that I want to comment was with Javier is that when I see
the beach briefly there.
When
anyone whose cell phone, I have a rule, anyone whose cell phone goes off does not get a right to ask a question.
When you see the relation of the different Latin American presidents with Venezuela, I think that the relation is basically, you can resume that relation in 2 words. It's a good business. It is very impressive for me, for example, how Felipe Calderón, right now that is a very strong enemy or one of the bigger speeches against the Venezuelan regime, goes to Venezuela in order to look for the check because CEMEX was nationalized. We see the same case of Álvaro Uribe. Álvaro Uribe tried to maintain a very good relation to collect all the debt that the private sector, that Venezuela owns to the private sector in Colombia, and until he realized that was unsustainable. For example, when President Lula say right now that Venezuela need to sit, or the Venezuelan government need to sit with the opposition, I have doubt if this is a change in the position of President Lula looking for to support human rights, looking to support the freedom of speech, etc., or it's basically maybe a delay that Venezuelan government have with Odebrecht. This is the big question that I always have with some of the positions that many of the Latin American countries have with Venezuela.
Okay, with that, let's open it up for discussion, for questions. Diana, please identify yourself.
Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution. I'd like the panel to address the role of China in this. They're holding $54 billion of debt. Maduro went off there last June, I believe, didn't come back fully satisfied. To what extent can the Chinese bail out Maduro?
Want to take that? Luisa, let's start with you.
It's interesting to me that when Ramirez came back, he only came back with $4 or $5 billion from the Chinese. He didn't come with $20 billion from the Chinese like Chavez did in 2012. So 2010. So it's I think that the Chinese are highly exposed already to Venezuela, and I think they are not going to bail them out. the same questions about debt sustainability that we have in the markets, the Chinese might be asking exactly those same questions. And it seems to me very interesting that even the level of foreign exchange reserves that the Chinese give Venezuela is completely tied. I mean, this is not fungible money. You cannot use this to pay anything that you want. It has a lot of strings attached, and you cannot access those dollars easily. And they do that for a reason. They do that because they want that money to finance oil projects that the Chinese are involved in, so that they can increase oil production and see and protect their investments. So I don't think that the Chinese are an actor in terms of a political actor that will bail out Venezuela, but just an actor in the sense that now the debt service to the Chinese is as important as the debt service to bondholders. And so there are questions about, okay, if you had to choose between the two, how would you go about, if you had to restructure that debt, would you restructure the bondholders or would you restructure the Chinese? Which one is easier? Which one is, with what actor the consequences are worse? So I think much more than Chinese has the Venezuela backing, I think the Chinese had a very good relationship with Chavez. Once Chavez is, after Chavez, it seems to me, that they have taken quite some time every time they negotiate any kind of agreement. So it tells me that they're cautious.
Any other comments?
No. I want to complement a little bit with this regard. I think that the line of credit with China to Venezuela is already at the roof. They are not willing to increase this line of credit. But also I need to say that this is an agreement, or these are agreements that are beyond Venezuela. I mean, this is an agreement that starting back in 2006, there was different agreement that China signed with Chile, for example. They also signed in order to be sure to receive the copper that Chile produced. This is also a different agreement China signed with Ecuador, with different African countries, and was a very clear policy back in 2005, 2006, with a very strong growth that China have, is how they can be sure to receive the commodities that they need in order to feed the growth that they have. So I think that this is broader than Venezuela. The most important one, by sure, is Venezuela, but I also believe that it's going to already, that is like a line of credit that is at the top, and the Chinese are not willing to continue increasing that line of credit.
Other questions? Yes. We got microphones on the way. What? No, there we go. Thank you.
Recently I read that...
Identify yourself first.
Yes, my name is Alexandra Beach. I read that the foreign airlines were thinking about pulling out of Venezuela because of the significant debt with the government. And then also there's talk of massive layoffs because of the current situation. And so together, sort of with everything, it seems that if UNASUR does form this commission that say the U.S. would join, which has asked the U.S. to join, and there were to be a real conversation, that the government would have to agree to some sort of action. And recently, Jennifer McCoy from the Carter Center wrote that the reason that the Friends of Venezuela initiative failed in some ways years ago was because there was no enforcement of the agreement between the Venezuelan government and the opposition. So I'm wondering, if both sides seriously did come to an agreement, what would enforcement of that agreement look like, given how precarious the situation is right now?
All right, that's more of a political. Well, I want to take a round of questions, and then we'll let, as we're doing this. I'll say, by the way, I was just in Cuba last week, and the microphone right back there. And Ramirez, the oil minister, was in Cuba a couple weeks before, and had basically started to give the warning that things are already starting to pull back. So it's good to see second thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Laura Ratner with Macquarie Holdings. I have actually two questions, if you don't mind. One also pertains to the UNASUR. Certainly we can draw a lot of parallels between the protests that we've seen in Chile, Brazil, and Venezuela, but the responses from the government is highly different when we talk about torture and shootings and all the things that are happening in Venezuela. So how can UNASUR continue to support this regime under those circumstances? And the other question is really on the oil sector. There's been a lot of talk or concerns whether the US can actually cut off Venezuela. So I was wondering if you can comment on that. Can the US completely stop buying from Venezuela?
Anything else? What else? Let's just start with you, because you dodged the last question.
To say that the agreement failed because of enforcement is not really an explanation. We want all agreements to be enforced, and so this is the crux of the matter. How do you get the government to not cheat, or any actor for that matter, to not cheat when you don't have troops on the ground, for example, which is the mechanism that one could use in a civil strife? I think that one of the things that the opposition should focus on is to demand measurable things that the government will have to do during the negotiations, such as, let's talk about the electoral body, the CNE. Let's make sure that nobody from UNASUR leaves until we reform the body that monitors elections. And so if you focus on institutional changes, you do those in terms of like these negotiations won't end until those institutions have been reformed, you're in a better situation than based on promises that we'll never do that. I wish the opposition could move into that mind frame of focusing on specific institutional demands. This is something that they could learn from the transition to democracy in Mexico, where the opposition parties played that game. It's complicated, and in the end, the government can cheat. You know, there is a long history of this government not meeting its commitments, but at least you can get the government to show signs of some institutional changes in politics. And on the, let me say something, may I go back to the responses, because you're absolutely right. When President Rousseff in Brazil or Piñera in Chile faced these protests, and even Bachelet in 2006, nobody talked about fascists. Rousseff talked about them as real legitimate protests. There were immediate negotiations. In Chile, there were changes in the cabinets, 3 programs, 3 plans. And let me just give you these numbers, because they're very, very telling. In Chile, only 1 person died during 2.5 years of protests. And the protests were massive, perhaps more massive than in Venezuela. And the international community complained about the carabineros, the police force in Chile. And there was only 1 student dead. And there were about 1,800 arrests in a period of 2.5 years. In Venezuela, we are, I don't know the death toll so far, in the upper 20s, 29, and 1,600 arrests in just a month in protests that are a little less. So this is absolutely right. In fact, the response of the United Nations has been far more forceful and remarkable, because we don't often get the United Nations to comment on Latin American affairs. But the about 5 experts from, human rights experts from the United Nations are absolutely appalled by the government's response. So yes, you're absolutely right, and a lot of people are criticizing the Latin American presidents for their, they treated their own citizens in ways that the Maduro government isn't treating their own citizens. But as Alejandro was saying, and as Luisa was explaining, and we were saying, there are too many economic and political interests here to get them to turn against Maduro at this point, even though there is no difference. There's no question to my mind that the Maduro administration, there are a lot of people who like to call themselves Chavistas. I don't think there are many people outside of Venezuela who like to call themselves Maduristas. And that is perhaps the biggest difference between the years under the Chavez administration and Maduro. And in many ways, this is the achievement of the opposition, is that it got Maduro to reveal his true colors. And these numbers are very telling comparatively.
I'll say one thing before I have them comment, just to exercise or abuse my right as a moderator. To your question about the 2004 in the sense that the government didn't meet its obligations, the problem wasn't just the government. It goes to in part what Javier is saying. But the problem was also structural, because you had in 2004 two organizations that mediated the compromise, and then two organizations that stuck around to observe the elections, the referendum that were the result of that compromise. You violated the fundamental principle of international mediation. You had two groups serving as juez y parte.
Right,
they
exactly.
were suddenly judge and participant. They were committed to seeing that referendum happen no matter what, because it was their product. So consequently, they turned a blind eye when you saw them release a list of the signatories and the petitions. When they violated electoral standards, violation would have never stood the test under any other electoral conditions. The use of public funds, the violations of independence of the media, but the Carter Center and the OAS wanted to get to that referendum come hell or high water because it was theirs.
Yeah.
The problem is they violated their own integrity and their institutional independence. And I think that's the problem, is if this opposition is going to get to the point and demand specific things, what it has to do is demand we want someone else to monitor what happens afterwards and not the same people who are at the table.
Have you told Jennifer McCoy?
I have.
Yes,
I
I bet she loves it.
No. But I'm more than willing to say that the elections may not have been stolen, as the opposition alleges. Yeah. And the problem was the opposition made a mistake, is they should have been demanding, they doubled down on a set of allegations they could never prove, and instead didn't demand that they actually get. And the problem is, I think Jennifer took a beating for the wrong issue. I'm not advocating anyone beat Jennifer, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I think their reputation took a few dents from the wrong issue, when actually they shouldn't have been there to observe in the first place. Anyway, sorry, Luisa, did you want to add anything to the comments on, not my own, just rant?
Yes, there was the question about cutting off Venezuelan exports. To be honest, at this point in time, I think, I mean, you will have an effect on oil prices, an immediate effect on oil prices, but the damage will be more to Venezuela than to the U.S. But I don't think you can do that. I mean, you do have you have long-term supply contracts with U.S. companies. You have joint ventures that Venezuela, for example, when you look at company-specific imports from Venezuela, you see that some of the oil goes to Venezuela's joint venture with Exxon. Some of the oil goes to Venezuela's joint venture with Conoco refinery. Both of these refineries are in the U.S. So I would say about 500,000 barrels per day are locked in, either through Venezuela's own refinery assets in the U.S. or through this kind of joint ventures, not even long-term supply contracts. These are, so it seemed to me that this is, things have to get really, really, really difficult. I think this is not even on the table, and I'm not sure that will be even considered. So far, the history of the Chavismo is to actually say that they're not going to sell oil to the U.S. The U.S. has really never threatened to do any such thing. So I think it's very telling that they have not said anything about not selling oil to the U.S. because I think it's now more important for Venezuela, because in today's world, having refinery assets in domestic markets is what's going to get your oil marketed, because there is a war, not a war is too difficult of a word, but an increasing competition for market share in the key domestic markets.
Other questions? No, you had your cell phone on. Yeah, over here.
That's a way to avoid it, Chris. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the panel. Ben Ramsey from JP Morgan. This might be an unfair question, but to the panel, if the conclusion here is protests are going to linger and perhaps escalate, and that the economy is ultimately unsustainable, and maybe I'm wrong, but if those are the conclusions, what are the dynamics and the timing around endgame for Venezuela? Is this going to be a constitutional process, extra-constitutional process? Or is this just muddled through? I mean, Maduro till 2019.
No one wants to predict, but anyone want to try? It's look into your crystal ball.
Gracias, Luisa. Siempre tan amable. I mean, when I say that it's a non-sustainable economic process or non-sustainable economic model, one of the things that I am expecting, okay, is that government will change. Okay, maybe it will be too little, too late, but this is a process of constant changes okay, that the government have. If you asked me 3 months ago if they will implement the CICAT 2, I was very skeptic. I received from different authorities that they will do it like last June of last year. But this is a model that has some changes, okay, in the meantime. For example, one of the biggest changes that was I didn't see too much on the newspaper right now, on the media, is the proposal that Nicolás Maduro is doing to create a card, okay, like a debit card, where the Venezuelan government will distribute all the subsidies, okay, but they will try to focalize the subsidy and reduce the general subsidy that we already have on the domestic price of the gasoline and many of the domestic price or many of the prices of food and medicine. So one of the things that I am looking for the government that could be very positive is to move from general subsidy to a specific, to focalized subsidies that could help a lot the fiscal account. We have an example with when Iran increased the oil price, okay, and this is an example, by the way, that was brought by the opposition to the debate, and that the government is taking in order to try to increase the domestic price of the gasoline through this a debit account that will be open to the poorest sector of the population.
Any other comments? Any other questions? John, I'll let you, but you're checking your cell phone at the door next time. Go ahead, the microphone's right there.
My apologies.
No.
And actually, Chris, question is in part directed to you, because one had the sense from the Cubans or from people in Cuba during the Chavez years that they were something of a restraining influence, that there was a don't go down our path because look where it got us kind of sentiment. If you read the Miami Herald today, it sounds like the country's been taken over by Cuban forces and they're responsible for everything that's going wrong. Now, I'm curious, both your panelists and what your sense is of the Cuban take on this and the relationship that they're playing to the process.
I'll reserve my
Is that
comments for
okay?
later. That's fine. That's fine. Lower your cell phone doesn't go off. Javier.
Look, I do think that the Cuban government has at some points contained some possible excesses. However, the Cuban government, in my opinion, has nonetheless provided the basis for the most radical discourse that the government is exercising. The whole idea of converting Venezuelan politics into class warfare and to blame the private sector is all a Cuban script. And the Cubans believe that this is a populist measure, that it is easier to blame all the ills on the private sector and capitalism and the United States. And this is, from an ideological point of view, a very toxic element, because it is, going back to what we were saying before, it's one of the reasons why this government cannot enter into conversations with the opposition, because it feels too attached to this class warfare mentality that comes from the Cubans. Having said that, I do think that there have been moments in which the Cubans have softened the regime. We do know, we suspect strongly, that the misiones of end of 2003 and 2004, which saved the Chavez regime, was also a Cuban script. So maybe the Cubans are going to be able to offer Maduro a way out of this particular trap that it is falling into. So Cuba plays this dual role. On the one hand, they're very committed to the radicalization and to ensuring that the private sector is always in check, at bay, curtailed, weakened, never prosperous enough. But yes, one can imagine moments in which they could offer some moderating words to Maduro. I mean, this is remarkable. Venezuela is the only Latin American country that has 2 cabinets. I don't want to say 2 presidents, 2 cabinets. And so I wish I knew more about what the Cuban cabinet is telling, but I appreciate the question, because I think it makes us think about the ways in which the Cuban influence is both bad news, but could also be pragmatic.
Let me take for a complete different approach your question, because yesterday we have a demonstration against the Cuban influence in Venezuela. So this is something that I do not understand, why they made this demonstration, and I will say why. We didn't talk about the media, but everybody knows that the media channels are very limited for the opposition leaders to try to position one message. Okay, it's very hard for Enrique. Okay, Enrique have more than a year without going to Globovisión, for example, or without going to any other TV channel on that front. So yesterday we have a demonstration against the Cuban influence when the Venezuelans, 75% of the Venezuelans believe that President Maduro is doing nothing in terms to solve the problem of scarcity. 80% of the population believe that President Maduro is not doing anything in order to solve the problem of insecurity, in terms to solve the problem of employment, in terms of solve the problem of inflation. Between 75 and 80% of the Venezuelan, when we see the data, okay, we see that, of course, 100% of the opposition believes that. Yeah. But it is important that 85% of the people who are undefined, that the one that we're presenting, that analysis called the Nini, 85% of the people of the Nini are thinking that Maduro is not doing anything to solve this problem. And more importantly, 50% of the Chavistas believe that President Maduro is doing nothing to solve the problem of scarcity, employment, inflation, security. Entonces, why will go to a demonstration against the Cuban influence if all Venezuelans, okay, are looking or believe that the government is not doing anything in terms of inflation and this type of problem? Because at the end, and this is a very important thing that was also reflected on the polls, the principal problem in Venezuela is that half are Chavistas or followers of the President Chavez and half are on the opposition. The only way that the opposition could be an alternative of power if they can build a big majority, not a majority of 50 plus 1, because we already know what could happen as happened last year. But they need to build, they need to send the message to 10, 50% of the Chavistas that there is a better way to do the things, that are better things to manage the oil wealth, and that they need to convince them to vote for the opposition. And this is something that happened in April. In April last year in the presidential election. Something that is very important of this result is that Enrique Capriles convinced 700,000 Chavistas that on October vote for Chavez, but in April vote for him. And this is the only way that I believe that we can solve the political distress that we have.
I want to key off both of the comments because I agree. The first is, I think the Cuban, let's first establish the Venezuelan government, the Chavista, the Maduro government, is key to Cuba's being able to survive at a certain level. The 100,000 barrels per day of oil, or whatever they are, they'll say they've been reduced, has thrown a lifeline to this regime, and in response, the Cuban government has sent 40,000 some doctors, sports trainers, whatever those are, and military advisors, intelligence advisors.
For which Cuba gets more money, too.
Yes, and also I discovered actually a lot of those doctors are writing prescriptions to sell Cuban pharmaceuticals, by the way. It's a nice game.
Yep.
So they are very much benefiting from that, and they very much need that, especially as they're going through a process of change, incremental economic change. They really depend on that. And I think they'll do everything they can to maintain that lifeline or that sort of flow, especially in these moments of insecurity. Now, the question, and I think it's precisely that reason that there needs to be some sort of larger strategy. Now, the problem is, are they sanctioning or allowing or even encouraging the crackdown in this? And I don't think we really know. I think it's tough because the Cubans' mentality is very different than the Venezuelan mentality. In all due respect to my Venezuelan friends, it's one of institutions. They did a very good job advising the Venezuelans on how to basically vitiate and politicize the CNE, Supreme Court, state, certain segments of the armed forces. What's going on in Venezuela right now is near anarchy. That is not sort of in the Cuban, to use again the DNA, that's not sort of the way the Cubans deal. And so it's not in their interest to see a complete deterioration or a trend towards anarchy in Venezuela. And I think at what point they're going to realize that this is no longer in their interest, that they're going to lose their lifeline or their patronage anyway and just start looking for other alternatives? I don't know. Clearly, having just been in Cuba, they're beginning to discover part of that will be Brazil. And a whole series of Brazilian investments are being negotiated right now. There's a Mariel port. And I think that's very important. I think Cuba is clearly hedging its bets. And I actually think, to the extent to which, to be honest, if the opposition could start to maybe even peel off Cuba from Maduro and say, look, you won't lose everything. We'll figure out a way. But instead, they've created this zero-sum game that pits them not only against Maduro, but against Cuba. In the same way, in case of the United States, the U.S. is doing the exact same thing as Trump, beating this drum of some segments of Cuba and Venezuela. And I think in the meantime, while Brazil is playing a larger chess game, that they understand that they can play a moderating role and even a brokering role in Cuba and Venezuela, the U.S. is playing solitaire. So, I mean, I think they're important, but I think it's difficult to believe that. I mean, a perfect case in point. During last summer, during the Snowden asylum issue, all the ELBA countries offered Snowden asylum except for Cuba. Why is that? Because Cuba, I won't speculate exactly how this happened, but Cuba clearly understood it was not in their national interest to engage in such inflammatory, symbolic acts. That's a different Cuba than we saw 10 years ago, and it's different than we see sort of in the other ELBA nations. I think that needs to be recognized.
Brazil didn't offer Snowden asylum either.
That's right, exactly right. Even when you actually asked for it in Brazil, he actually hadn't asked for it in Bolivia.
But, you know, because he knew it wasn't going to be offered.
Yeah.
Yeah, but look, I think that the opposition is trying to appeal to the nationalist wing of the Chavistas. I think it's going to backfire. I totally get your point, but I think this is perhaps a sign of desperation that perhaps they have tried all possible tricks to bring Chavistas into the fold. It's not happening. Let's try this nationalist card. I don't think it's going to work either.
I think it's also a message to the military.
It's a message to the military, yes.
That's what I assumed you were saying.
But I don't know whether the military resents, maybe, but yes, there is a very explicit, constant messaging from the opposition to the military, which I think is a very dangerous game, but it is part of what's going on here with the Cuba.
I think just to elaborate on what all of you have said, the decision-making process in Venezuela has been hijacked. I don't think it's hijacked by the Cubans. I think it is hijacked internally. I mean, the whole...
By the military?
No, it's not hijacked by the Cubans. It's hijacked internally, not by the military. Alejandro and I have followed the soap opera that is the FX regime change in Venezuela. It's a soap opera. It's incredible that it's taken 1 year to do something that they announced last year, in April last year. So it just tells you that there's a problem in the decision-making process. There is a lack of leadership. There is no way to efficiently deal with alternative options. There is the radicalism is a straitjacket on the ability, which you have mentioned, with the ability for them to see beyond a certain recipes of things. And so it just takes them too long to react, and there has to be too much negotiation internally. And I think, to me, one of the most important risks from a policy perspective is the lack of technical capacity. And so all of that combined leads to this, this very disorganized way in which they deal with economics and with politics. They cannot think, there's too much group thinking taking place, and I think what we're seeing is that the result of internal divisions within the groups. The fact that Maduro cannot really negotiate, I think, has to do more about the divisions within the Chavismo than anything else. But it is really making them not responsive enough to any of the challenges politically and economically and on the oil market that they should be reacting to. And it seems to me that they have ADD. They cannot, while the political situation was happening, they could not take any decision on the economic front. It's too disorganized and too anarchic. And I think that is going to be very problematic. I mean, for them to survive the 6 years, they have to solve the decision-making process.
And you do agree with it? I think we're all. It's wrong to see the Cubans as sort of the ominoff grease behind everything, as these secretive advisors that are pulling all the strings and calling all the shots. And
I fully agree that the level of disorganization is so huge. No? One of the
Okay, don't blame that
one
on the
of the
Cubans.
one of the things that doesn't have anything with Cuba. One of the beliefs that, for example, people have is that this year Minister Giordani didn't want to devalue, and Merentes and Ramirez on the other side want to devalue, or the radicals didn't want to devalue, and the pragmaticals want to devalue. This is wrong. Everybody wants to devalue. Minister Giordani said that the cheapest thing in Venezuela was the exchange rate after the gasoline price. Okay, Merentes was looking at the devaluation. All the economic team agreed to devalue the currency of the 6.3, but at the end was apparently Celia Flores, the one who came and said, no, you cannot devalue Maduro. And it's something that is completely out of sense. They were very near to take the decision, and they made one step back. Right now, they don't know, or they didn't know what to do with the 5X rate, because it's not the Cadive rate. But this is something that is happening at all levels. You can meet with the president of the central bank or with the minister of oil, and they'll tell you something that at the end you cannot believe. Because in all this a fight of power, he could lose or he could win, and the result will be something completely different of what they have on that front.
Great. Any last questions? We have 5 minutes. Actually, okay, we'll go to the woman who hadn't had a question, then Diana, who already had one.
Just, Javier, could you elaborate on the 2 cabinets, please?
Oh, no, I was simply referring to the fact that there is the domestic cabinet and conversations with Cuba. There is, especially during the first year of Maduro, so many trips to Cuba, including Cabello going to Cuba. The choice of Maduro, for example, and the way that the succession was orchestrated was all done in Havana. And so I was only referring to the fact that this is a government that talks to these 2 seats of government. If I may say something about this point of the incoherence at the cabinet level, 2 things. Maduro feels so weak that he cannot be decisive, and this is part of the problem. He could use the current crisis to do something that he has never done because of his weakness, which is, I'm going to fire a bunch of folks in the cabinet whom I've inherited from Chavez and perhaps from the Cubans. And this is what you do in a crisis like this, is to do a cabinet reshuffle. He has never done this. His cabinet is very much a Chavista cabinet, a Cuba cabinet, and a military cabinet. He has a great opportunity to begin to show decisiveness in this crisis, and yet he hasn't done it, which to me tells me he feels very weak, very beholden, and this explains the lack of coherence that you are describing when it comes to making decisions, for which there could be some consensus, at least on the economic team. They're too afraid. Also, Chavez always knew that he could win elections, but Maduro is very nervous. And so he's so afraid of little errors, and this gives him a lot of insecurity. And I think people can smell that insecurity. And if you look at, for example, the way that Raúl Castro orchestrated his own succession in Cuba, at first he inherited Fidel Castro's cabinet, but by the second year, he had already changed the cabinet enough to be able to now say, you know, I'm not beholden anymore to the Fidel gang. And Maduro is not there yet. It's a very same cabinet that was agreed upon in January through March of 2013.
Last question up here. Actually, we'll get to you. That's the one behind you is a question.
Could my name is Mercedes Alvarez. Could one of you approach the subject of Leopoldo Lopez being in jail, please?
Okay, let's take the second question, because that's a quick, easy one. Woman up here had her hand up. Right here, there.
I just had a question.
Identify yourself.
So, Jasmine from the Interpress Service.
Okay.
Do you think they're going to touch on the humanitarian issues, just with like the protests and the deaths and the arrests, and what has their response been to the UN?
Okay, let's start in the order. Let's start in reverse order, just for these last ones.
Let's start with that.
No, okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Let me say that the arrest of Leopoldo Lopez has got to be the worst mistake that the government made. It has reunited the opposition and has given the government a very visible political prisoner. Terrible mistake. And it has also been figuratively as well as literally wonderful for Capriles, because Leopoldo Lopez is kind of away, and so now it's Capriles again. In many ways, this has been perhaps one of Maduro's most serious mistakes. The second serious mistake is the human rights abuses. If you look at the list of demands by the students, and they have produced their list of demands, at the very top, number one, number two is the human rights issues having to do with let's release the political prisoners, and number two, let's disarm the ununiformed side of the state. So for the opposition, it is central. It has become more central as the protests went on. Whether this is something that the government is willing to do, I don't know. There are, maybe you guys will know, but there is less reliance on the colectivos recently. I don't know if you have sensed this or if you think this is a pattern or what, but maybe we're moving to a world in which colectivos are playing a less significant role. The government has not started any serious effort to investigate human rights abuses. In fact, there has been nothing but praise of the way that the National Guard has conducted the response to the protests.
I would add that to me, the people in the government lasted 15 years with Chavez, and they really don't know how to do politics, and that's part of what I was saying, that decision-making process that takes them to make such a mistake of putting Leopoldo in. I mean, it's such, why would you do that? It is obviously a political prisoner. There is no other way to...
Well, but they made a martyr as well. It's
yeah, I mean,
made a political martyr.
Why, one of the things that, with all the things that Chavez had, Chavez knew when to back down. Chavez knew how to take advantage of it. That's why he was such a political such a formidable political opponent, because I think his understanding of the political moment was much clearer, and he had it for all of them. And so when he's gone, they don't know how to do politics. They've never had to do politics. They've actually never had to win really an election because everything was under Chavez. So what we're seeing is a group of people that in order to understand whether Chavismo is going to survive really in the long term, we have to see them behave as a political force. And so far, politics is not in the toolkit. And so the first reaction is repression and censorship. And it seems to me that there's really nobody putting politics as a toolkit. And it's, it's like the education of the Chavistas in to understand what the country that they're living in. And I think they're clearly behind the curve. I am not sure that they will arrive in time, but they need to be taking care of the situation. And that's why I think international involvement is so important, because without more international involvement, I am not sure that that's the clear cost that they understand. They obviously do not understand the consequences that they, from the point of view of human rights, unless it becomes an international issue. So to me, international involvement will work, will make this a much more safer process as we go along. Without it, if Venezuelans are left to their devices, I remain concerned because of the lack of the use of political tools by the government.
Alejandro, any quick final thoughts?
Yes. With this regard, I need to say that I am a very close friend of Leopoldo. Luisa and me started to have some political discussion when we were a student back in 1996. And something that worries me is that, yes, the government made a mistake. But after they made the mistake, the opposition was weak. I mean, we don't see very important demonstration trying to defend the case of Leopoldo. And right now, and this is the thing that worries more to me, is that Leopoldo is an asset of the negotiation. They will not be released if the government do not found okay, something to compensate that relief. I mean, we'll be part of the negotiation, and this, at the end, if they start the dialogue, etc., he could be in prison for a longer time than many people is believing.
Let me close by saying the last issue of America's Quarterly is out. It has nothing to do with any of these issues. This was just shameless propagandizing and selling. But here it is. Let me also say, actually, this is the best Venezuela panel I've seen, and that includes 2 that I was on. So, as a speaker, this is very good, very factual and detailed and comprehensive. So please join me in thanking the speakers tonight.